All right, time to go teach. Hello and welcome to this next episode of Tutor Tutors, continuing our unit on evolution, and today we are going to be talking about species. In the past few episodes, we have looked at what factors can cause change in a population over time, and we have also looked at the ways in which those changes could occur. But today, we're going to be looking at what actually is the definition of a species, and can new species be formed? Targets of the day. First, we are going to define what is a species. What do we mean when we say organisms are of the same exact species? And then we are going to describe different types of what is called reproductive isolation. Hint here, that's going to be what differentiates different species from each other. And lastly, we are going to compare and contrast the two types of speciation. We are also going to define what speciation is. So let us get started. First, species. It is a group of organisms that are able to reproduce and have viable offspring. A viable offspring means that those offspring are also able to reproduce. Or it's a group of organisms that are not reproductively isolated from each other. This is a more exact way that we can define what a species is. Reproductive isolation is going to be a better way of understanding species. There are two different types of reproductive isolation. It is prezygotic isolation and postzygotic isolation. And remember that the zygote is what is formed when the egg and the sperm meet. They join and they form a zygote. When our gametes fuse together, that is a zygote. Prezygotic isolation happens where the organisms do not produce a zygote. This is reproductive isolation, that is, before forming a zygote. So they don't end up forming a zygote, and there's a few reasons why. One is called mechanical isolation, which means that the actual sexual organs of these different organisms are not compatible for each other. They are not able to reproduce with each other because of an incompatibility with their sexual organs, either by the shapes or by the sizes. Temporal isolation. This is due to when the organisms are going to actually reproduce. Organisms have specific times in which they are going to have their mating season, for example, and that is going to determine what other organisms they will reproduce with. They will reproduce with other organisms that are mating at the same time as them. If two different groups mate at different times, no matter how compatible they might be, if they don't mate at the same time, they will not be able to breed with each other. That would be prezygotic isolation. This could occur with sea turtles. This could also occur just in a field, depending on when the different pollen is being released from our plants. It could also be what's called ecological, where we could have different organisms that all look basically the same. They all have the same general size, shape, structure, but because they live in slightly different habitats, their range does not overlap. They will not actually reproduce with each other. They will stay where their natural habitat is and not venture to where the other organisms are. This could also be due to some geographical barrier, where the organisms are separated out by mountain ranges or rivers, streams, or across continents. That would cause these organisms' populations to never come in contact with each other so that they will not be able to mate. It could also be a behavioral, where the organisms might compete for the same food. That's not going to be conducive to mating. Behavioral isolation could also be linked to courtship rituals, to songs that birds sing, or the way that they make a nest and attract a mate. That can also end up having a behavioral isolating component. And we also have gametic isolation, which means even if the gametes were to come in contact with each other, they are incompatible and are unable to form a zygote. Even in the ocean, where you might have a bunch of different organisms releasing egg and sperm into the water, different species, eggs and sperm, will not form a zygote because those gametes are incompatible with each other. In a field where you have pollen of many different species landing on many different species of flower, the pollen from different species is unable to fertilize that flower. It will not be able to form a gamete because it is of a different species. That is prezygotic isolation, where these groups of organisms are unable or don't form a zygote for some specific reason, whether it is mechanical or temporal or ecological or geographical or behavioral or gametic. In postzygotic isolation, a zygote is formed, but that zygote, when it develops into an adult organism, is unable to reproduce. The classic example of this is a mule. When donkeys and horses mate, they can produce a mule, but that mule is sterile. It is unable to have offspring on its own. It is not viable. And over time, within a population, new species can be formed. The formation of a new species is called speciation. And this formation can occur in two different ways. It can either occur sympatrically or allopatrically. In sympatric speciation, for whatever reason, the organisms in a population, some of them are going to become reproductively isolated from the others. But they do this within the same geographical boundary. So a new allele could form. And if this new variant in this population were to become reproductively isolated from the main population of fish, then we would end up with, now, instead of just one population of fish, we would have two populations of fish, each one its own species, because the new variant doesn't reproduce with the original population, meaning it is a brand new species. And these two populations now do not share the same gene pool because they do not reproduce with each other. That is sympatric speciation, where a new species forms within the geographical boundary of the original species. In allopatric speciation, what occurs is that there is a geographical barrier at some point in time that occurs. And now these two populations evolve independently of each other, causing one population to change differently than the other population. And then if we were to take away this barrier, these two populations would no longer be able to interbreed because of their divergent evolution, because they evolved independently of each other, and they are now reproductively isolated groups. That is allopatric speciation, where you have a geographical boundary between the different groups. So in summary, organisms of the same species, they are not reproductively isolated from each other. That is how we define a species. But mutations can occur which can cause reproductive isolation within a population. And if reproductive isolation is formed within a species, then that is actually going to form a new species, either sympatrically, where there is no geographical boundary, or allopatrically, where a geographical boundary has been formed. And that is species. Until next time, be awesome, stay awesome.